What if a belief system followed by over 1 billion people contains ideas that fall apart under simple questioning? Islam claims to be the final revelation from an all-knowing God, perfectly preserved and suitable for all time. That is a serious claim. When any system presents itself as flawless and beyond correction, it invites examination. In this video, we will look directly at 10 Islamic beliefs that do not hold up when tested against logic, consistency, and modern understanding. This is not about culture or identity. It is about ideas. If a belief is true, it should survive scrutiny. Let's begin. Number 1. The claim of a perfect and error-free Quran. One of the central claims in Islam is that the Quran is the literal word of God, perfectly revealed and completely free from error. This is not presented as symbolic or inspired writing. It is presented as flawless speech from an all-knowing being. That is an enormous claim. A perfect book from a perfect source should contain no contradictions, no confusion, and no inconsistencies. Yet when the Quran describes human creation, multiple explanations appear. In different verses, humans are said to be created from clay, from dust, from water, and from a clot. These are not described as poetic metaphors within one unified explanation. They are presented as separate origins. If a modern biology textbook gave 4 different materials for the origin of humans without clarification, it would not be considered profound. It would be considered confused. Muslim apologists often argue that these descriptions refer to stages of development. The problem is that the text itself does not clearly outline such a scientific sequence. The interpretation comes later, after readers notice the inconsistency. A book claimed to be perfectly clear should not require later reinterpretation to avoid contradiction. There are also verses that describe the sun setting in a muddy spring, which appears in Surah Al-Kahf. Many modern defenders say this is simply describing perception from a human point of view. Again, that explanation is added later to resolve tension with modern astronomy. The plain reading suggests something else. A divine text should not depend on evolving explanations to stay aligned with science. If it truly comes from an all-knowing source, it should not appear scientifically limited to a 7th century understanding of the world. The issue is not whether believers can reinterpret difficult passages. The issue is whether a book that repeatedly calls itself perfect should contain passages that require rescue. Once you accept that parts must be explained away to preserve the claim of perfection, the claim itself weakens. If perfection needs defense, then it is no longer perfect. Number 2. The inimitability challenge. Another major Islamic belief is the claim that the Quran cannot be imitated by any human being. This is known as the inimitability challenge. The Quran itself challenges critics to produce a chapter like it if they doubt its divine origin. For many Muslims, this is considered proof that the book must come from God. The problem is that this claim is entirely subjective. Literary beauty is not a measurable scientific standard. What sounds powerful or profound to one person may sound repetitive or unclear to another. Arabic speakers raised within Islamic culture are taught from childhood that the Quran represents the highest form of language. That belief shapes perception before independent evaluation ever begins. If someone claims that no human can ever compose something similar to the Quran, how would that even be tested? Who decides what qualifies as similar? A Muslim scholar? A literary committee? The standard is undefined. Without a clear and objective benchmark, the challenge becomes unfalsifiable. If someone writes a comparable text, believers can simply say it does not meet the standard. The standard remains permanently out of reach. When translated into other languages, the supposed unmatched beauty becomes even harder to evaluate. In English or other translations, the Quran reads like an ancient religious text with repeated warnings, promises, and moral instructions. It does not appear categorically beyond human capability. The claim of linguistic miracle relies heavily on reverence and prior belief. History also shows that pre-Islamic Arabia had a strong tradition of poetry and eloquent speech. The Quran emerged within that environment. It reflects the style and rhythm of that culture. That does not automatically make it divine. It makes it culturally situated. Calling something unmatched does not make it supernatural. Beethoven's music is extraordinary, yet no one argues that its excellence proves divine authorship. Declaring a text impossible to imitate is a statement of faith, not evidence. If the strongest proof of divine origin depends on personal taste and cultural conditioning, then it is not proof at all. Number 3. Angels. Recording every action. Islam teaches that 2 angels accompany every human being, recording every good and bad deed throughout their entire life. These angels are described as constantly writing, preserving a complete account that will be presented on the Day of Judgment. This belief is treated as literal, not symbolic. It is meant to reinforce accountability and divine justice. Examine the scale of this idea carefully. With more than 8 billion people alive today, that would require at least 16 billion angels actively documenting behavior at every moment. That number does not include the billions who lived before us. The image presented is one of constant surveillance and detailed bookkeeping. The question is simple. Why would an all-knowing and all-powerful God require assistance to record actions in real time? If God is truly omniscient, then every event, thought, and action is already known without the need for documentation. The concept of recording implies limitation. It suggests that information must be gathered and stored for later review. That model reflects human bureaucracy, not divine perfection. Ancient kingdoms relied on scribes to track laws and behavior. The idea of heavenly scribes mirrors that system. Some believers argue that the language is metaphorical, that angels do not literally use pens or physical records. Yet the tradition consistently describes them as real entities performing a defined task. If it is only metaphor, then much of the fear associated with this constant monitoring loses its force. The doctrine depends on literal belief to function as intended. There is also a psychological dimension. The belief creates a sense of permanent observation. Every private act is allegedly logged and preserved. This mirrors authoritarian systems where citizens behave differently under constant surveillance. When people believe they are always being watched, compliance increases. The system regulates behavior internally without visible enforcement. The deeper problem is conceptual. A timeless, infinite being would not require assistance to maintain records. The need for record-keeping arises in systems where memory is limited and evidence must be preserved. Applying that structure to a divine being introduces unnecessary complexity. When descriptions of divine justice resemble administrative procedures from ancient empires, it becomes difficult to distinguish revelation from projection. If omniscience requires clerks, then omniscience is no longer coherent. Number 4. Jinn and supernatural possession. Islam teaches the existence of jinn, invisible beings created from smokeless fire who live alongside humans. They are said to influence events, whisper thoughts, cause mischief, and in some cases possess individuals. This belief is not peripheral. It is embedded in the Quran and further expanded in Hadith literature. Entire chapters discuss them as real entities with communities, intentions, and moral responsibility. The concept of jinn did not appear in a vacuum. Pre-Islamic Arabia was already filled with stories of desert spirits, unseen forces, and supernatural beings inhabiting lonely places. Islam absorbed these ideas and reframed them within a monotheistic structure. Instead of eliminating the mythology, it reorganized it. The jinn became another creation of God, accountable on Judgment Day. The first issue is evidence. There is no verifiable, testable proof that such beings exist. Claims of jinn possession almost always involve symptoms that modern medicine can explain through psychology or neurology. Epilepsy, schizophrenia, severe trauma responses, and dissociative disorders have historically been labeled as spirit possession across many cultures. Islam provides a religious explanation rather than a medical one. In various communities, exorcism rituals are performed to expel jinn. Individuals are shouted at, restrained, or physically pressured under the belief that an invisible being must be driven out. In extreme cases, people suffering from mental illness are denied proper treatment because their condition is interpreted as spiritual rather than medical. The harm here is not theoretical. It is measurable. Supporters often argue that jinn belong to a realm beyond scientific detection. That response makes the belief unfalsifiable. If something cannot be observed, tested, or detected in any measurable way, then its existence cannot be meaningfully distinguished from imagination. Declaring something invisible and undetectable protects the claim from scrutiny, but it does not strengthen it. The worldview behind jinn reflects a time when unexplained phenomena were attributed to spirits. Before germ theory, disease was blamed on unseen entities. Before psychology, unusual behavior was blamed on possession. As scientific understanding expanded, the territory once occupied by spirits steadily shrank. If jinn truly interacted with the physical world, there would be consistent, observable patterns beyond anecdotal testimony shaped by expectation. Instead, reports vary widely by culture. That suggests social influence rather than supernatural activity. A belief rooted in ancient folklore and sustained without evidence does not become reasonable simply because it is sacred. When superstition replaces investigation, progress slows. Number 5. Eternal hell for finite actions. Islam teaches that hell is a place of eternal punishment for those who reject belief or die without proper repentance. The descriptions are graphic: fire that burns the skin, only for it to be restored and burned again. Boiling water poured over heads, chains, darkness, and endless suffering. This is not described as temporary correction. For many, it is permanent. Focus on the proportion. A human life lasts a few decades. Within that short span, a person may question religious claims, follow a different faith, or simply remain unconvinced. The punishment for disbelief alone is described as eternal suffering without end, not centuries, not millennia, forever. The imbalance between finite actions and infinite punishment raises a serious moral problem. Justice, as humans understand it, requires proportional response. Even the most severe legal systems do not impose endless punishment for limited crimes. A penalty without end removes proportion entirely. It transforms justice into perpetual retribution. If God is described as perfectly just and perfectly merciful, eternal torment for disbelief seems incompatible with both qualities. Some defenders argue that disbelief is an infinite offense because it is directed against an infinite being. That explanation assumes the very claim under debate. It presumes that rejecting a proposition about divine authority is itself a cosmic crime, deserving endless pain. From a rational standpoint, disbelief is simply non-acceptance of a claim that has not been sufficiently demonstrated. There is also the issue of circumstance. A child born in a non-Muslim country is overwhelmingly likely to adopt the religion of that culture. Geography strongly predicts belief. Are billions destined for eternal punishment because of birthplace? If salvation depends on correct doctrine, then accident of birth becomes one of the most decisive factors in eternal fate. The doctrine of hell also functions as an enforcement mechanism. The cost of doubt is infinite suffering. Under such stakes, questioning becomes psychologically dangerous. Fear replaces open inquiry. The belief system protects itself by attaching catastrophic consequences to disbelief. A morally perfect being would not require eternal torture to assert authority. Human parents do not burn their children forever for disobedience. The concept reflects ancient systems where rulers maintain power through threat and spectacle. When punishment loses proportion and mercy disappears into infinity, the idea of justice collapses. Number 6. Divine predestination and free will. Islam teaches that everything happens according to the will of Allah. Every event, every choice, every accident, and every outcome is already written. This doctrine is known as divine predestination. At the same time, Islam teaches that human beings are morally responsible for their actions and will be rewarded or punished accordingly. These two claims create a serious logical tension. If every action is already decreed, then human freedom becomes questionable. If a person commits a crime, that act was already written by God before the person was born. If someone disbelieves, that disbelief was also written. Punishing someone for fulfilling a pre-written script raises an obvious problem. Responsibility assumes genuine choice. If the outcome is fixed, the choice is an illusion. Some Muslim theologians attempt to solve this by saying that humans choose their actions, but God creates the outcome of those choices. Others say that God's knowledge does not force behavior. It only knows what will happen. These explanations try to protect both divine control and human accountability. The difficulty is that if God not only knows but has willed and written every event, then the system appears predetermined at its core. Consider natural disasters. When a child dies in an accident, believers often say it was the will of Allah. When someone is murdered, that too is described as part of divine decree. Yet, the murderer is still punished. If the act was part of God's will, then the moral responsibility becomes blurred. If it was not part of God's will, then divine control is incomplete. The psychological effect of predestination is also significant. When tragedy strikes, people are encouraged to accept it as divine will, rather than question preventable causes. Instead of demanding safer systems, better laws, or improved healthcare, the response often becomes passive acceptance. The doctrine can discourage accountability at a societal level. There is also the question of prayer. If everything is already written and cannot change, what is the function of asking God for different outcomes? Some argue that prayer itself is part of what was written. That explanation keeps the system internally consistent, but it removes meaningful flexibility. It turns life into a scripted narrative in which every plea and response was predetermined. Holding absolute divine control and genuine human freedom together creates a contradiction that has troubled theologians for centuries. The tension has never been fully resolved. If free will is real, then total predestination cannot be absolute. If predestination is absolute, then freedom is reduced to appearance. Which one is it? Number 7. Women's testimony. Being worth half of a man's Islamic law, based on the Quran and reinforced through classical jurisprudence, states in certain financial matters that the testimony of 2 women equals that of 1 man. The commonly cited verse is found in Surah Al-Baqarah 2:282, which instructs believers to bring 2 male witnesses, or 1 man and 2 women, so that if one woman forgets, the other can remind her. This ruling is not presented as cultural advice. It is presented as divine guidance. The justification often given is that women are more emotional or more prone to forgetfulness. In 7th century Arabia, women were less involved in trade and public contracts, which defenders argue explains the instruction. The problem is that the Quran claims to be a timeless and universal guide, not a temporary tribal manual. If the rule reflected social conditions of a specific time, then the claim of eternal applicability becomes questionable. In the modern world, women serve as judges, lawyers, scientists, executives, and heads of state. Their cognitive ability is not inferior to men. Numerous psychological and neurological studies show no inherent intellectual deficiency in women that would justify discounting their testimony. If divine law assigns lesser, evidentiary weight based on gender, it contradicts observable reality. Some argue that the verse only applies to financial contracts and not to all legal matters. Even if that limitation is accepted, the principle remains. A woman's reliability is treated as structurally weaker in at least one domain. That raises the question of why an all-knowing deity would embed a gender-based distinction that does not align with equal intellectual capacity. There is also the moral dimension. If justice depends on accurate testimony, then credibility should be evaluated based on competence and honesty, not gender. Modern legal systems assess individual reliability, not biological category. The Quranic ruling appears tied to the social structure of its time rather than universal human equality. When defenders say the rule was progressive for its era, they may be correct historically. In a tribal environment where women had limited public roles, granting them any legal recognition may have been an improvement. The issue is not whether it was progressive in the 7th century. The issue is whether a perfect and final revelation should reflect the assumptions of that century. If divine law mirrors the limitations of its historical context, then it begins to look less like eternal wisdom and more like cultural inheritance. Number 8. Punishment for apostasy. In classical Islamic law, leaving Islam is treated as a serious offense. The commonly cited basis comes from Hadith literature, where the Prophet is reported to have said that whoever changes his religion should be killed. Over centuries, this became the foundation for apostasy laws in many Muslim societies. In several countries today, leaving Islam can result in imprisonment, social persecution, or even death. This raises a basic question. If Islam is true and self-evident, why does it require punishment to prevent people from leaving? Truth does not need coercion to survive. If a belief system is convincing on its own merits, people will remain by conviction, not fear. The existence of severe penalties suggests insecurity rather than confidence. Defenders often argue that apostasy in early Islamic history was equivalent to political treason since religion and state were intertwined. Leaving Islam was seen as joining hostile forces. Even if that explanation reflects the political reality of the time, it reinforces the core issue. The rule emerged within a specific historical and tribal context. If the punishment was tied to political stability, then it was not purely a timeless spiritual command. There is also the matter of conscience. Belief cannot be forced. A person either finds a claim convincing or does not. Threatening punishment may control outward behavior, but it cannot manufacture genuine conviction. When disbelief is criminalized, it suppresses honest inquiry. People remain silent not because they are persuaded, but because they are afraid. Modern principles of human rights recognize freedom of religion as fundamental. The right to adopt, change, or abandon a belief system is central to intellectual autonomy. If Islam claims to guide humanity toward truth, it must allow individuals to examine that truth freely. Criminalizing doubt undermines the very idea of sincere faith. Supporters sometimes argue that very few apostasy executions occur in practice. Even if enforcement is rare, the existence of the rule sends a clear message. Doubt is dangerous. Questioning is risky. The social consequences alone can be severe, including ostracism and family rejection. A belief system that threatens death for leaving reveals something about its structure. It suggests that unity is maintained not solely by persuasion, but by fear. If faith requires compulsion to survive, then it becomes difficult to distinguish devotion from compliance. Number 9, ritual prayer 5 times a day. Islam requires believers to pray 5 times daily at specific intervals from dawn to night. These prayers are highly structured. The number of units, the words recited, the physical movements, and even the direction faced are prescribed in detail. Missing prayers without valid excuse is considered sinful. Consistent neglect is treated as a serious spiritual failure. The question is simple. Why would an all-powerful, self-sufficient creator require repeated daily affirmations of submission? If God is perfect and beyond need, then human ritual does not add anything to that perfection. The structure resembles a system of loyalty reinforcement rather than a necessity for a divine being. Supporters argue that prayer benefits the believer, not God. It creates discipline, mindfulness, and connection. That may be true psychologically. Repeated routine can structure a person's day. The issue is not whether structured reflection can be beneficial. The issue is whether a supreme being would mandate specific mechanical movements and precise timings as conditions for approval. The ritual aspect is strict. Facing the Kaaba in Mecca is required. Specific Arabic recitations must be performed. Minor deviations can invalidate the prayer. This level of procedural detail resembles regulatory law more than spiritual reflection. If the goal were sincere gratitude or contemplation, it would not require uniform choreography. There is also the question of universality. In regions near the poles where daylight cycles are extreme, calculating the 5 prayer times becomes complicated. Scholars must issue adjustments because the system was designed around normal equatorial day cycles. This reflects a geographical origin. A universal mandate would not depend so heavily on specific environmental conditions. Another tension lies in intention. A person can perform all 5 prayers daily while acting dishonestly outside the ritual. The system emphasizes compliance with scheduled acts rather than ethical consistency in all moments. If moral character is the ultimate concern, then constant formal recitation seems secondary. When prayer becomes compulsory, repetition tied to fear of punishment, it risks becoming mechanical. The act is performed to avoid sin rather than to pursue understanding. The structure may strengthen group identity, but it does not automatically strengthen critical thought. A timeless and infinite being would not require precise daily rituals to maintain authority. The requirement reflects a system that prioritizes visible obedience. When devotion becomes regulation, spirituality becomes administration. Number 10. Miracles without evidence. Islam, like many religions, includes accounts of miracles attributed to Muhammad. One of the most famous is the claim that the moon was split in 2 and then restored. This event is described in Islamic tradition and is treated by many believers as a literal, historical occurrence. Other reports describe trees greeting him, water flowing from his fingers, and animals speaking in his presence. These stories are presented as signs of prophethood. The problem is evidence. If the moon had physically split and rejoined, it would have been a global astronomical event. Civilizations across the world observed and recorded celestial phenomena. Chinese, Indian, Persian, and Byzantine astronomers documented eclipses and comets. Yet there is no independent historical record confirming a literal splitting of the moon during the time Muhammad lived. The absence of corroboration raises serious doubt. Some defenders argue that the event was local or only visible to certain people. That explanation reduces the scale of the miracle. A cosmic event limited to a small audience contradicts the idea of a clear and universal sign. Others suggest that the verse referring to the moon is metaphorical. If that is the case, then the literal miracle loses its foundation. The same pattern appears with other reported miracles. They come primarily from hadith, literature compiled generations after Muhammad's death. These reports rely on chains of narration rather than direct physical evidence. The farther removed a story is from the original event, the greater the possibility of embellishment. Miracle claims are not unique to Islam. Christianity describes resurrection and walking on water. Hindu traditions describe divine incarnations performing supernatural acts. Each religion presents extraordinary events as proof of divine authority. Yet none of these claims meet modern standards of verification. Believers often say that miracles, by definition, transcend scientific explanation. That position removes them from scrutiny, but does not establish credibility. An extraordinary claim requires proportionate evidence. Without it, the claim remains assertion. If divine truth depends on events that cannot be independently verified, then acceptance becomes an act of faith rather than reason. A system that asks for belief in historical impossibilities without external confirmation relies heavily on trust and tradition. When miracles resemble legends common across many cultures, the simplest explanation is not supernatural intervention, it is myth formation. And once myth is recognized as myth, the foundation begins to shift. If this video gave you some value, make sure to subscribe to Reason Over Rituals and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next breakdown. Feel free to share and leave some comments below. We love to continue the discussion. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.